Hello all. Today we're going to look at one of the most famous and popular nursery rhymes, Jack and Jill. Who were Jack and Jill? Why were they going up a hill to fetch water? What are the medical properties of treating a wound with vinegar and brown paper? And who was old Dame Dob? Let's start with the rhyme itself. The most famous part is also the earliest. It comprises of 4 lines and talks of a young couple who go to collect water by going up a hill, and the story goes on to explain that disaster strikes when Jack falls and hurts his crown or head, and Jill falls too, but her medical status is not recorded. The rhyme is first found in a reprint of John Newby's Mother Goose Melody, thought to have been published in London in around 1765. However, the leading experts in the field of nursery rhyme origins, Iona and Peter Opie, who we'll return to again and again in these videos, suggest the rhyme may be much earlier in date, on the basis of the rhyming of water and after. In the sure knowledge I'm going to mispronounce them, I'm going to go for water and atta. The second verse, which is perhaps less well known, appeared in the early 19th century. The words of this additional verse have seen some changes over time, but they helpfully expand on the story and we learn the fate of our heroes. I won't recite it out loud to avoid demonetizing my channel so early in its life, but suffice to say, Jack's head gets patched up by someone called Old Dame Dob. Aspects of this verse have been amended in more recent publications of children's nursery rhymes for reasons of public decency. In the early 19th century, there were dozens of versions of the rhyme, with as many as 15 verses. These extended versions add a number of characters and animals, including a dog, a goat, a pig, a bull, a goose, a camel, basically anything you fancy, and we won't be exploring these additional verses here. They're mostly used to develop the story of Jack and Jill into pantomimes. But if you'd like to pause the video, you can look at some of the verses and then come back and we'll find out who Jack and Jill actually were. These added verses appeared often anonymously in chapbooks. Chapbooks were cheaply made and crudely illustrated books, often containing extended versions of popular nursery rhymes. This was a period when children's literature in England was beginning to shift from being used to warn against dangers to a focus on fun and nonsense stories, but still sometimes with a moral dimension, as in this case the somewhat opaque maxim, the more you think of dying, the better you will live. In America, this moral dimension remained in some versions of Jack and Jill. Among the juvenile stories written and set to music by Fannie E. Lacey in 1852 was a 6-stanza version of the rhyme. Having related the climb and tumble down the hill, the rest of the poem is devoted to a warning against social climbing. By this we see that folk should be contented with their station, and never try to look too high above their situation. This seems a bit harsh to me, given that Jack ends up on disability. Moving on from the different versions, what about Jack and Jill themselves? What do we know about them? There are quite a few theories here which I've drawn from various books and websites for the purpose of this video. Some are fairly fanciful, but half the fun of nursery rhymes, and largely the reason for this video, is looking at the ways people try to interpret and make sense of their meaning. The name Jack has a long history in English language stories, and is used often in nursery rhymes such as Jack Sprat and Jack Who Jumped Over the Candlestick, and in fairy tales like Jack and the Beanstalk, and for real people like the pet name for John F. Kennedy. It's also been used to denote working men, as in Jack in the Pack of Cards and Jack of All Trades. Jill has also been linked with describing the everywoman, and most early references to the names of Jack and Jill use them in the general sense of lad and lass. Shakespeare made reference to Jack and Jill in terms of lad and lass. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck attests Jack shall have Jill and naught shall go ill, but there doesn't seem to be any direct link between these quotes and the nursery rhyme. And in modern times, we see the names adopted in the names of adjoining sinks or in labouring jobs, such as Lumberjack and Lumberjill. In the earliest version of the rhyme, Jill is spelt with a G rather than a J, but importantly was always pronounced the same, and despite the suggestion by some authors that this 18th century woodcut depicts 2 boys, there's no evidence of the story ever being about anything other than a boy and a girl climbing a hill. So what's the rhyme all about? The oldest explanation, at least in terms of drawing on antiquity, is that put forward by Reverend Baring Gould. Writing in the 1860s, he was convinced the story was actually about Yuki and Bill. In Norse mythology, they were 2 children who were captured by the moon when drawing water from a well. Apparently, if you look up at the full moon, the shape of the children can be seen carrying the bucket on a pole between them. The Reverend Gould believed the names of Yuki and Bill, or maybe Juki and Bill, were anglicised to Jack and Jill. The only problem with this theory is that, other than the vague similarity of the names and the reference to carrying water, there's no connection to any other aspect of the rhyme, like especially the falling down part. It's almost certain to be English in origin, and Norse mythology wasn't widely known in 17th century England. The next theory comes from the village of Kilmersdon in Somerset in the southwest of England in the year 1697. According to this story, Jack and Jill were a real unmarried couple, expecting a baby. When Jack was hit by a boulder from nearby Badston Quarry, he died of his injuries, leaving Jill heartbroken. She died of grief just after giving birth to their son. He was raised by villagers with the surname Gilson, which, according to sources, is a common name in the local area, although I'm not sure this is quite true. I only found 4 in the phone book, and why would the young boy be known as Jill's son rather than using her own surname? Nonetheless, the village has really bought into this theory. There's Jack and Jill Hill, on which there are 6 roadside markers, each displaying a part of the first verse. At the top of the hill, which has to be said is rather a gradual incline, there's a school with a gate showing the protagonists, alongside a well and a plaque commemorating the events. But there's no historic evidence that Jack and Jill ever existed, and if young Gilson was born in 1697, he might have been alive when the rhyme was first published in the middle of the 17th century, but there's no record of him being orphaned in any of the chapbooks. The next few theories come from Tudor England, and this time Jack and Jill are monikers for members of the royal court. There's some history in the use of false names to describe historic events, or at least so we're told by those who try to make sense of the rhymes. One example being Mary Mary quite contrary, apparently being a secret way of criticising Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Mary I. I can do a video on that if you're interested, right in the comment section below. With Jack and Jill, the monikers could be Richard Epsom and Edmund Dudley. They were the chief advisors to Henry VII, who reigned from 1485 to 1509. Henry was famously a miserly monarch, and his taxation policies were hugely unpopular. On the death of the king, his son, the more famous Henry VIII, bowed to pressure from his nobles, and Epsom and Dudley were charged with treason and executed on Tower Hill in August 1510, seemingly breaking their crowns. Why the need for the use of a girl and boy fetching water is not really expanded on in this explanation of the story, and why would you use false names to describe the events, which after all were sanctioned by the king? And again, this is a very long time ago in terms of nursery rhymes. So, moving on. The next theory comes from the imagination of Catherine Elwes Thomas. In her The Real Personage of Muzzle Goose, published in 1930, she suggests that Jack represents Henry VIII's chief advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, and Jill has now morphed into Antoine de Castelnau, the Bishop of Tarbes. In this version, the rhyme tells the tale of the attempt to arrange the marriage of Henry VII's sister, another Mary, no imagination these Tudors, to King Louis XII of France, and the subsequent fall of Wolsey and Castelnau, and so they fall down the hill. There are some holes in this theory too. Not least, why talk about a boy and a girl fetching water to tell the tale? It's a story everyone knew about, and there was no need to create a clandestine rhyme. A bigger issue is that Wolsey's demise was not until 15 years later, and was much more closely aligned with Henry VIII's attempted divorce of Catherine of Aragon. There's also the slight issue that Antoine de Castelnau, the Jill in this telling, didn't really come tumbling down at all. He became the French ambassador to Spain, dying peacefully in his bed in Toledo in 1539. So, moving on. Perhaps the rhyme relates not to people at all, but rather taxation on alcohol. Personally, I quite like this one. A gill has been used in England to describe the measure equal to a quarter of a pint since the 14th century, while a jack was twice the size of a gill. Charles I of England, soon after coming to the throne in 1625, was strapped for cash and so tried to reform the taxation on liquid measures, ordering that volume of a jack be reduced but the tax rate should remain the same. The gill, by definition, was therefore automatically reduced too. There's also some suggestion that the reduced measure was supplemented by publicans, adding water, if not necessarily a pail worth. The taxation policy angered an already restless Parliament, and when Jack fell down and Jill came tumbling after, the crown of England was broken. By 1641, civil war raged in England, and Charles was charged with treason and had his head cut off at the Customs House in Whitehall. To be fair to this interpretation, there are some aspects which might plausibly be linked to the rhyme, but there's no record of it being sung this far back in history, so again, it feels like making Charles's punishment fit the rhyme. So let's move on to when two crowns rolled, this time the French Revolution. Jack now has turned into King Louis XVI. The French are no more original with their names than the English, and Jill, his queen, Marie Antoinette. Their beheading, or if you like, the loss of their crown, took place during the French Revolution in 1793, so this fits well with the fate of Jack and Jill. That's if we ignore the first publication date of the rhyme 30 years earlier, and the Opie's view that the rhyme of water and after suggests it's even earlier than that. If only Louis had known the rhyme, he could have saved his head, apparently. So we're none the wiser about the meaning of the rhyme. What about the words? Is there any reason Jack and Jill would be going up a hill to fetch water, and can vinegar and brown paper help if you've banged your head? Well, this is fundamentally a nonsense rhyme, so going up a hill to fetch water plays into that. But they could be going up a hill to get some water. They could have been going to a dew pond. This is an artificial body of water, usually sitting on the top of a hill, intended for livestock. Dew ponds are used in areas where a natural supply of surface water is scarce, and despite the name, dew ponds, or sometimes cloud ponds or mist ponds, are primarily filled with rainwater. There's no well, but we could put that down to artistic license. What about the second verse and the use of vinegar and brown paper to fix Jack's head? Well, again, there could be some truth in this. The use of cider vinegar is a very old remedy to reduce the swelling and bruising or to relieve headaches. Brown paper traditionally is not really paper as we know it. It's the name for a mixture of old rope and canvas or sacking in the 18th and 19th century, although it was very coarse, was used to apply an ointment to the skin. You take the brown paper, soak it in a saucepan of vinegar. The vinegar is heated and allowed to simmer, making sure the paper doesn't break. The paper is then applied with layers and wrapped with cloth. Apparently, it's also used for toothache and nosebleeds. This brings us to Old Dame Jill, or sometimes Old Dame Dob, who apparently administered the brown paper remedy. Who is this third character in the story? For the most part, Dame Dob seems to have been added later to bring some colour and a different dimension to the story, mostly scolding the children. But as ever, add a character to a nursery rhyme and someone will search for an underlying historic meaning, and I'm no exception. Could it be that Dame Dob is related to the story of Charles I and the alcohol tax? Stick with me here. Old Dame Dob is said to be Elizabeth Trevelyan, the wife of Sir Robert Carey. Now, I've never heard of him either, but Sir Robert became a governor to young Prince Charles in 1605 when his father James I was on the throne. Sir Robert's wife, apparently known as Dame Rob or Dame Dob for short, nursed the young prince. Charles was a sickly child suffering from a stammer and a bad case of rickets. These combined to mean he didn't walk or talk until he was 3. But when Jack, who now has morphed into Charles, fell down, it was old Dame Dob who nursed him with vinegar and brown paper. What about the tune? The melody used most often is an 1870 version by composer and nursery rhyme collector James William Eliot. He turns up quite a lot in these videos. It was published in his National Nursery Rhymes and Nursery Songs. Before that, we know there was an earlier version published in 1777 as a round by the English composer Charles Burney, but that's largely fallen out of use. And finally, what we're not going to talk about, one of the worst movies ever made. So what can we conclude about all these theories? Well, basically we haven't got a clue where it comes from, other than that it's a fun rhyme which dates from perhaps the early 17th or 18th century. Like most rhymes, there's no firm foundation in real events, but it's none the worse for that. We don't always need to find meaning in things, and we can just have fun thinking about the histories of rhymes. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like, and if you'd like to hear more nursery rhymes, you can write in the comment section below. Bye for now.